يصعب حصر عدد زوايا النظر والمداخل التي يمكن الولوج منها إلى موضوع أوروبا وفلسطين، إذ يستحيل فصل فلسطين عن علاقات شمال المتوسط وبجنوبه وشرقه
It's difficult to list out the number of perspectives and approaches that can be taken to the subject of Europe and Palestine, as it is impossible to separate Palestine from the relations of the northern Mediterranean and southern and eastern Mediterranean in its various forms and congratulations throughout history. It therefore makes sense, if our topic is the Palestinian question, to start with the 19th century and the growing colonial interest that developed in the Arab East, which included the Levant and Palestine. It is not surprising that we take the origin of the Zionist movement in Europe as our starting point. That century saw a rush of European theologians, clergymen, travelers and geographers traveling to Palestine. Some of them conducted surveys of its natural environment and population and sought to confirm their religious beliefs about it by projecting their own in details, while others examined the possibility of reviving the imagined Jewish kingdom according to biblical history. They were not Zionist travelers, not even Jews, but European Christians, mostly Protestants. The Zionist activists Ben-Gurion and Benzi from Poland and Ukraine, in the introduction of their 1918 book, The Land of Israel in the Past and Present, which they wrote in New York after being expelled from Palestine and by the authorities, expressed their surprise at the lack of writings and the research on geography and history on the country by Jewish researchers, and that the majority of writings and surveys on Palestine up to their time had been produced by European Christian historians and travelers and theologians, often motivated by religious reasons. This is indeed remarkable, as there is no shortage of Jewish historians and researchers, but that they did not write a single book on the geography and history of Palestine. Palestine was not a subject of interest to secular Jews before Zionism, and the religious were not concerned with scientific research, surveys, and mapping, and the relationship of most of them with what they called the land of Israel was not of a secular nature. In any cases, in the conquest of America in the 16th, 17th centuries and other parts of the world, religious motives were mixed with colonial ambitions, geostrategic and economic, and also competition between the great powers to divide up the world. This is true of the colonial interests in the Arab East more than anywhere else. Until that period, the Palestinian question had not yet emerged as a separate question from what was then called the Eastern question, but there was certainly a Jewish question. The Jewish question preceded the Palestinian question historically, but it was a purely European issue. We did not delve into its religious and social class background and the emergence of racial theory, as the subject has been extensively covered in studies on anti-Semitism already. In any case, against this backdrop, the Jewish question arose from European modernity, specifically when the major European countries began to implement policies of integration for Jews and gradually rectified their situation, including the repeal of laws that discriminated against them. Its source lies in the conflict between those who supported the integration of Jews and the granting of legal equality to them as part of a secularization of state institutions and neutralizing them religiously, and those who opposed this integration with allegations related to the nature of the Jews and their religion and law, their inability to integrate, and the falsity of their loyalty to the countries in which they lived, not to mention the weaving of myths such as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion about the existence of a plot against countries, fueling class conflicts between them and even provoking wars between them in order to weaken them. In any case, in the second half of the 19th century, it became clear that there was a Jewish question in Europe and that it was also being used to vent internal conflicts by directing resentment towards an internal enemy, exploiting a mixture of Christian religious hatred from the remnants of the Middle Ages, ethnic nationalism and racial theories, taking the form of waves of repeated violence against Jews. The Russian word is pogrom, or in a form of social discrimination against them in countries where legal equality had been achieved, for instance, Western Europe. Zionism arose in Europe at the end of the 19th century, influenced by Jewish enlightenment, Haskalah, and at the same time, as a rejection of it. The Jewish intellectuals who founded the Zionist movement opposed the assimilationist tendencies of the Haskalah, even though most of them were assimilationists before adopting Zionism, and asserted that Jews were not merely a religious community of religious sects, but rather one people as such. Some of them insisted that they were an ethnic group at a time when ethnic theories were in vogue, but at the same time, they were the product of European reforms that brought them out of the ghetto and Jewish enlightenment that encouraged modern education and the practice of various professions, and they shared this opposition to the isolationism of religious movement in the ghetto. As is well known, the religious movement rejected integration and insisted that Jews continue to live according to the Jewish law and preserve their unique lifestyle, even if it meant living on the outskirts of the countries that were hostile to them, and known in Hebrew as ghetto or golan, meaning exile. Zionism agreed with the religious movement in rejecting integration. Zionism refused to consider the integration of Jews as individuals with equal rights in European societies as a solution to the Jewish question. However, unlike the religious movement, it called for integration into European civilization by establishing a nation-state like other European countries as the only way to solve the Jewish question, but outside Europe through involvement in European colonial projects. The Zionist movement's vision of its main mission and historical function can be summarized as what we might call in our time nation building through the creation of a state by transforming the Jews from mere religious communities led by clerics who consider exile to be divine punishment and await divine salvation with the coming of the Messiah into a national community, even if it was united only by religion in the absence of a common language and culture, and making up for the loss of a common land by nationalizing the religious longing for Palestine as the biblical land of Israel. That is, transforming it into a national longing in the quest to establish a nation state like those in Europe. I also emphasized the need to reverse the stereotypical image of the weak and submissive exiled Jew from their perspective, which Zionist theorists use the worst terms to describe, into a proud national character through physical labor on the land and bearing arms, creating muscular Judaism as Max Nordau, the second man in the Zionist leadership and its chief ideologies during the founding phase of the World Zionist Organization, used to call this. This is where the first conflicts arose between Zionism and three Jewish currents hostile to it: the religious Jewish currents, of the liberal Jewish currents hostile to Zionism, which believed that Zionism threatened the achievements of European and Jewish enlightenment in achieving equal rights for Jews, as well as Jewish leftist and socialist currents that believed that the solution to the Jewish question lay in achieving socialism in European countries.
أوصافهم لشخصية اليهود أقصد أوصاف الصهيونية اليهودية المنفى إلى شخصية تحويلها إلى شخصية قومية فخورة من خلال العمل الجسدي في الأرض وحمل السلاح.
With the emergence of Zionism, Jewish hostility towards Zionism arose. The conflict was existential as it revolved around the definition of Judaism. It is a nationality, or is it supposed to become a nationality through Zionism, which adopted modern nationalist ideology, or is it a religious sect as considered by the religious and secularists, each from their own perspectives?
والتنوير اليهودي بتحقيق المساواة الحقوقية لليهود طرحوا مخاوف شديدة خاصة الإنجليز الليبراليين اليهود الإنجليز.
For the secularists, Judaism is a religion, and if the Jews are a people, they are a chosen people, unlike other peoples or other modern nationalities. And so they do not aspire to a nation state, but rather to divine salvation. For secularists, it is a religion and therefore does not constitute an obstacle to integration into secular, democratically neutral states, whether liberal or socialist. Anti-Zionist Jewish secular currents were composed of currents that embraced different interpretations of European Enlightenment, including liberal, democratic, socialist, and communist currents. As you know, the representation of Jews in the European left was much higher than their proportion of the population.
لقد تألفت التيارات العلمانية اليهودية المعادية للصهيونية من تيارات تتبنى تفسيرات مختلفة للتنوير الأوروبي، ومنها تيارات ديمقراطية ليبرالية وتيارات اشتراكية وأخرى شيوعية. وتعلمون جميعا أن تمثيل اليهود في
All these developments took place in isolation from the Palestinian people. And perhaps only a very few Palestinians heard about these European debates. The Palestinian people at that time were not hostile to Zionism, nor were the European peoples actually hostile to Zionism. Hostility to Zionism was a Jewish phenomenon because the conflict with Zionism revolved around the definition of Jewishness and the integration of Jews. There is no theoretical or historical connection between hostility to Semitism and hostility to Zionism. Historically, anti-Semitism in Europe is much older than hostility towards Zionism, and Europeans are hostile towards Jews for religious or ethnic reasons or because of economic competition, do not care whether a Jew is Zionist or not. As for the Palestinians, the original inhabitants of the country who began to emerge as a people undergoing a process of modernization and urbanization and developing national aspirations, they did not oppose Zionist settlements in Palestine because of hostility towards Jews, nor because of differences over the definition of Judaism after the emergence of Zionism, but because of suspicion about the intention and ambitions of the settlers. This suspicion was soon confirmed by the certainty that the goal of the settlement was to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. It did not occur to the early leaders of the Zionist movement to accuse the Palestinians of anti-Semitism. Never did it. I had to read all the writings in 6 volumes, and I saw that none accused the Palestinians of being anti-Semitic. It never came to their mind. Vladimir Jabotinsky, leader of its right wing, wrote in 2 articles in 1923 entitled The Iron Wall and The Moral Theory of the Iron Wall. He wrote that it was natural for Arabs, like any people with dignity, to reject settlement on their land, and that therefore force alone was the means to persuade them to accept settlement and surrender the establishment of a Jewish state on their to the establishment of a Jewish state on their land. So we have force is necessary, is indispensable, therefore. And the Zionist left, as for the accusing Arabs of anti-Semitism, this emerged after the establishment of Israel as part of an official propaganda strategy, or what is known as propaganda. It spread during the preparations for the 1977 war and afterwards. And there were accusations Israel in general of anti-Semitism and were said to be a part of the official Israeli propaganda. According to Azrael's memoirs and his speeches at the Zionist and conferences themselves, one of the most important arguments in persuading the European regime to support the Zionist project of establishing a national homeland for Jews outside Europe, especially in Palestine, was to tempt them with a relief of Europe from the Jewish question, which generates conflicts and contributes to Jews joining radical movements that threaten stability in European countries. All their discussions revolved around that. Some European leaders in the 19th century were convinced by Herzl's arguments, but they were not enthusiastic about implementation for practical reasons, such as conflicts and the lack of confidence in the feasibility of the Zionist project or other factors. This did not prevent the movement from organizing and establishing institutions that were beginning to settle in Palestine. However, the entire project would not have been viable, let alone successful, had it not been for 2 major global shifts. In spite of all the efforts that they deployed, they could not, it would not have been possible without this. And when global, I mean European at that time. The first event is the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in the World War I, the Franco-British agreement to divide the Arab East, this Henri Laurence mentioned earlier, Britain's agreement to cooperate in establishing a national homeland for the Jews in Palestine, and the British government's choice of a Zionist High Commissioner with his ideas and commission, the adoption of the Balfour Declaration, and the second event is World War II and the Nazi Holocaust. Despite all the organization and institutionalization endeavors made by Jewish settlers with backgrounds in political parties and trade union and other activities in their countries of origin, and despite the emergence of an organized Jewish population, the issue of within Palestine with institutions ranging from a settlement bank to institutions for purchasing and seizing Arab land, such as the Karen Kaimeth and the Organization for Settlement Guards, starting with the Hashomer organization and ending with the Haganah organization, which became the nucleus of the Israeli army and 2 universities, and the Trade Union Federation represented by the Istatut. The project did not succeed and could not succeed with gradual development. In spite of all this, the project failed, and it could not succeed through a gradual evolution. It was not possible. Jews remained a minority in Palestine, and it was not possible for them to establish a Jewish state without expelling a large part of the Palestinian population and seizing their land and property, which only became possible after the Nazi Holocaust. And this had nothing to do with the Palestinians, Arabs, and Muslims. After that, the Zionist movement was able to obtain a partition resolution from the United Nations and use it as a pretext to one-sidedly declare a Jewish state in a country where the majority of the indigenous population was Palestinian Arab. And therefore, they expelled by force the majority of Arabs living in Palestine during the 1948 war. And the leaders of the Zionist movement understood that it was not possible to create a state in Palestine without the support of several European states. And has to believe that settlement operation carried out by Muslims in Eastern Europe, such as the Love of the Zion movement, were the work of amateurs. He sought to issue a legal decree that would make Jewish immigration legal and under the auspices of a colonial superpower. At that stage, the word colonialism was not considered negative. Rather, involvement in colonial activity was seen as a sign of civilization and the spread of civilization, and therefore there was no problem in establishing institutions that supported settlement, such as the Jewish Colonial Trust and in German the Jüdische Kolonialbank. It was commonly found whether settlement in Palestine was supported by colonial research or by the initiative of funding of Jewish financiers in Europe, it remains colonial settlement because it creates an economy different from that of the country and a demographic environment different from that of the country for foreign purposes. This was at the exclusion of the local population. I would like to underline the fact that, and many researchers have said this, Israel has no problem by being considered a political entity. It has joining the club of countries such as the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand. Quite the contrary. It has reached such a level of self-confidence that they are ready to admit this history of theft and plunder, content with emphasizing Israel's historical religious connection, which has transformed the Torah into a real estate and political document. This confusion between the religion and politics, this religion fundamentalism, doesn't seem to bother any of the secular leaders in the West. Recent documents issued by the world's largest democracy, known as the Deal of the Century, are replete with religious and biblical terminology. They discuss the justification for the creation of Israel, stating that the land of Israel and Jerusalem are the promised land, and that Jerusalem is the eternal capital of the Jewish people. And that the Jerusalem is not explicitly mentioned in the Quran. But this settler colonialism did not settle down at that point and continued to expand in the 1967 war and still. It did not stabilize. It continued to expand. And in fact, to this day, they continue to annex new territories rather than dealing peace with the Arabs. It has not managed to absorb Gaza because they refuse any fair or fairly equitable solution. Therefore, Israel is involved in the creation of a system of apartheid, not only a populating policy, but one that generates a situation of segregation. So it's a colonization that generates an apartheid system. And there are different currents that justify the apartheid, others that negate this. But in any case, they refuse the creation of a Palestinian state. They refuse that the Palestinians living in this region to be eligible for equal rights. Therefore, Israel wants to govern the Palestinians without entitle them to rights and not entitling them to having a state. So neither individual rights nor collective rights. Europe has no objection to dealing with this reality of apartheid. You can't deny it. The European Union they even award privileges to Israel, likening it to a European state. They have found a new other outside the Jews to hate within their countries, and you know who I mean. They treat Israel as if it was the European countries. And they even make alliances with Israel as a state. So it's a European state, but outside the borders of Europe. So the Jewish question has been exported to where it did not exist, namely to the Arab and Islamic world and Arab world. To avoid many misunderstandings, the Jews of the East did not live in a paradise of tolerance, and they suffered in many periods, as did all minorities, from discrimination, but not as Jews, but as non-Muslims. The Jewish question is not being mentally replaced. So there were some discriminations for others than Jews, like Christians or non-Muslim, even the Shiite Orthodox. Therefore, in the Palestinian question has been replaced by the Jewish question. Just as sympathy is being shown to the perpetrator as if he were the victim. Of course, there were major crimes on the 7th of October, but it cannot be compared to the Holocaust. It is therefore also natural that the European leaders and the main media institution in Europe treat the 7th of October as the beginning of history and ignore everything that came before it, not just since the Balfour Declaration, but not just since the Nakba, not just since the 1967 occupation, but at the least since the imposition of a suffocating siege in Gaza, when Israel launched its latest brutal war and exceeded the limits of what Europe considers a justified response in the name of self-defense against terrorism, moving from revenge against the local population to waging a war of extermination with political objectives related to regaining control of Gaza, expanding settlements in the West Bank and Judaization of Jerusalem in the shadow of the war, as well as exploiting the war to settle the regional scores in Lebanon and Syria, and establish new areas of influence for itself in the region. There's a sophistical debate that ensued, not about what actually was happening, but about whether or not to use the word genocide and the sensitivity of its use on the continent where genocide has actually taken place. And so Israel continued to benefit from its monopoly on the role of victim in Europe, even as it bombed schools and hospitals and killed doctors, children, and journalists. The Gaza Strip Strip has been besieged for 20 years with no prospect of a political solution in Palestine, and the continued expansion of settlements in the West Bank has continued. Europe generally refrained from condemning Israel for crimes of occupation, contenting itself with condemning the settlers that they were criminal gangs on the margin and not agents of the state. It took no practical steps against the establishment of an apartheid regime in Palestine. It did not even go so far as to side with the victim. Official Europe has remained allied with Israel, and the most it has achieved rhetorically is to strike a balance between the two sides, encourage moderates, condemn extremists, and use the terminology that obscures the reality of occupation, an occupying state, and the people living under occupation. This has been a convenient form of escapism, especially given the acceptance that the main role of the West in the Middle East since 1956 has been played by the United States. The image of the leaders standing behind Trump at the recent Sharm el-Sheikh meeting was the best representation of Europe's adoption of the role of assistant, appendage, or extra. It is standing behind the country that provides unconditional support to Israel, even adopts its theological language regarding Palestine now.
إنه وقوف خلف الدولة التي تقدم دعما غير مشروط لإسرائيل بل في أمريكا وتتبنى لغتها اللاهوتية. الولايات المتحدة تتبنى اللغة الثيولوجيكال، اللغة اللاهوتية لإسرائيل.
The language of the United States is mimicking the Israeli lingo. The atrocity of the Israeli war in Gaza have reached the point of embarrassing Israel's allies. That is why the end of the war has also ended the embarrassment. Things stopped at the need to maintain a ceasefire, and it became important to end the war, even if it meant accepting Israel's terms. The US president, who appears daily in the media, asserts that the ceasefire is holding despite Israeli violations, because Israeli violations are part of the ceasefire. And the president threatens Hamas with violating and responding to Israeli violations. Now the Arabs can be called upon to normalize relations with Israel and urged to welcome war criminals and heroes of genocide in their countries, and there is no talk of a just solution to the Palestinian issue. Just as if the war had never happened. It's like for the Gulf War, you know. And as if the occupation and the neglect and marginalization of the Palestinian issue did not lead to war. The official Western and traditional media behavior during the war has caused great damage to the credibility of universal values embodied in or enshrined in the Declaration of Human Rights. Popular anger in our countries has gone beyond accusing them of hypocrisy to questioning the existence of such values. In our countries, what we see, what are these universal values? In a case, the postmodern thinking that states that universal values are merely Western discourse that is the product of power and control relations like any other discourse, the role of pre-modern thought in the countries of the Levant. And we find ourselves defending the moral references among victims at the expense of the effort and time needed to expose the perpetrators and their accomplices in discourses and press. However, the new thing here, and I will close on this, something that is an upnote, is the emergence of a new generation in Europe and the United States that takes moral values seriously, and for which universality is not just a word, but it means application of these values to others, to all human beings, as human beings. This generation does not derive its information about what is happening in Palestine from the media that is biased towards the occupying state, the state that prevents it from existing on the ground and covering what is happening. These traditional media are banned. They cannot work in the field. So this is new generation condemning criminals and stands in solidarity with victims. It rejects hypocrisy and the double standards. This is in a world where the superpower persecutes judges of the International Criminal Court and adopts wanted war criminals. Because those that are protected are the criminals that are sought by the justice, and a country that restricts freedom of speech, and they recognize that they asked for people to stand up to applaud them and come and say. So he's so outspoken that political analysts are losing their role and function now. Never mind. Perhaps this man is getting old. I suppose we're talking about the US president. Perhaps it makes it more comfortable for analysts. So these young people now dare to make their voices heard in countries whose leaders flatter an American president whose character they know well, thereby encouraging him to indulge in his whims. What is also new is that as they flatter the president, they encourage him. But what is new is that Israel and its associated pressure groups are now calling for the use of threats to livelihoods, travel visas, the denial of school places to silence mouths. That's very important to bear in mind, because in the past, Israeli propaganda did not need such repressive measures to silence its critics, as its discourse was dominant in Europe and North America without needing to resort to suppressing freedom of expression. Israel's loss of its discourse dominance in the West, including in Europe, is certainly the most important shift that we must note. The wave of solidarity must be transformed now from humanitarian solidarity with the victims and aversion to Israeli brutality into political solidarity that does not stop at a plan to end the war that includes all Israeli conditions without a just